They called it witchcraft because they could not explain it any other way. Cleopatra would enter a room, and within minutes, hardened generals who had fought across 3 continents would be leaning forward, hanging on her every word, forgetting the political calculations they had prepared and the strategic positions they had planned to maintain. It was not her face. The ancient sources are unanimous that her features were pleasant but unremarkable. It was not her body. She was small in stature and not particularly voluptuous by the standards of her age. It was her voice, her presence, the indefinable quality that the Greeks called ethos and the Romans struggled to describe. Plutarch said the charm of her conversation was irresistible, that the character that pervaded everything she said was utterly spellbinding, that hearing her speak was like listening to an instrument of many tones. Cassius Dio emphasized the same quality, noting that she could captivate anyone who listened to her. Modern psychologists might call it charisma or emotional intelligence, but the Romans had no vocabulary for someone who could dominate a room through pure force of personality without beauty, without intimidation, without wealth on display. She read people instantly, understood what they needed to hear, adjusted her approach for each individual she encountered. She made Julius Caesar feel intellectually challenged for perhaps the first time in decades. She made Mark Antony feel understood and appreciated in ways his Roman wife never managed. She made everyone she spoke with feel like they were the only person who mattered, and that talent was far more dangerous than any amount of physical beauty could ever be. Before we explore the real sources of Cleopatra's power and examine why intelligence threatened Rome more than beauty ever could, we need to understand how the myth of her physical perfection was created and why it has persisted for 2 millennia. If you find stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about history compelling, consider subscribing to join us as we uncover more truths hidden beneath ancient lies. The first thing to understand about Cleopatra's appearance is that we actually know what she looked like, at least approximately, because we have physical evidence from her own lifetime. Coins minted during her reign show her profile in the Egyptian style on one side and sometimes paired with Mark Antony on the other. These are not flattering portraits. The woman shown on these coins has a prominent, hooked nose, a protruding chin, thin lips, and a rather masculine jawline. Her features are strong and distinctive, but not conventionally beautiful by ancient or modern standards. Some scholars have argued that the coin portraits were deliberately unflattering, perhaps made by hostile mint masters or stylized according to conventions that did not emphasize beauty. But this argument is unconvincing because Cleopatra controlled Egypt, absolutely, including its mints, and she would not have allowed unflattering portraits to circulate as official currency if she had the legendary vanity that later sources attributed to her. The coins show us how Cleopatra chose to present herself to her subjects and to the world as a strong ruler, a legitimate pharaoh, a worthy successor to 3 centuries of Ptolemaic kings. Beauty was not the message she was sending. The sculptural evidence, though fragmentary and disputed, generally supports the same conclusion. A marble head in Berlin that may represent Cleopatra shows a woman with strong features and an intelligent, serious expression rather than idealized beauty. A basalt head in St. Petersburg attributed to her displays similar characteristics. The famous statue of Cleopatra as Aphrodite from Cyrene shows a female figure in classical style, but the face is damaged beyond clear identification and may not represent Cleopatra at all. The problem with all sculptural evidence from the ancient world is that we can rarely be certain who a particular statue represents unless it comes with an inscription or was found in a context that clearly identifies it. But the sculptures that are most confidently attributed to Cleopatra show a pattern consistent with the coins, a woman with distinctive, memorable features that suggest intelligence and authority rather than conventional beauty. The literary sources that describe Cleopatra's appearance are even more revealing because they were written by people who had access to eyewitness accounts or to earlier sources now lost to us. Plutarch, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century AD, had access to the memoirs of his grandfather and great-grandfather, who had known physicians who attended Cleopatra. He stated explicitly that her beauty was not altogether incomparable, not the kind that would strike those who saw her or amaze those who encountered her. Instead, he emphasized the charm of her conversation, the persuasiveness of her character, and especially the sweetness of her voice. He compared her to an instrument of many strings, capable of producing different tones for different occasions, able to speak with anyone in their own language without need of interpreters. This is not the description of a seductress relying on physical attraction. This is the description of an exceptionally intelligent woman using communication as her primary tool of influence. Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century AD, provided a similar account. He noted that Cleopatra was brilliant to look upon and to listen to, with the power to subjugate everyone, even a love-sated man already past his prime, a reference to Julius Caesar, who was 52 when he met the 21-year-old Cleopatra. But Dio emphasized that her influence came from her wit and her ability to adapt to any conversational partner, not from overwhelming physical beauty. He also recorded that she dressed magnificently and displayed herself in settings designed to impress, which suggests that she used staging and presentation to enhance her natural gifts rather than relying on beauty alone. The theatrical entrance rolled in a carpet, the meeting with Antony on a golden barge with purple sails, the careful management of lighting and costume in every public appearance. These were the techniques of someone who understood that power comes from perception, and that perception can be engineered. So if Cleopatra was not physically beautiful in the way that legend suggests, why has the image of the gorgeous seductress persisted for 2,000 years? The answer lies partly in Roman propaganda, which found it easier to explain Cleopatra's influence over their generals as sexual enslavement rather than intellectual attraction. Romans were deeply uncomfortable with the idea that a woman might be more intelligent than their greatest men, more educated, more sophisticated, more politically astute. It was much safer to attribute her power to beauty and sex, which could be dismissed as tools of manipulation rather than genuine assets. Octavian's propaganda campaign portrayed her as a dangerous seductress who had bewitched Antony and nearly done the same to Caesar, corrupting them through lust rather than convincing them through argument. This narrative served multiple purposes. It excused the behavior of Roman generals who had allied with her. It made Cleopatra into a threat that could be defeated rather than a legitimate ruler who deserved respect. And it reinforced patriarchal assumptions about women's roles and capabilities. The medieval and Renaissance periods amplified this interpretation, adding layers of moral condemnation about female sexuality and elaborate fantasies about Cleopatra's beauty that went far beyond anything the ancient sources had claimed. Dante placed her in hell among the lustful. Boccaccio included her in his catalog of famous women, but presented her primarily as a cautionary tale about the dangers of passion. Medieval manuscripts illustrated her as a European beauty with blonde hair and fair skin, completely ignoring her Macedonian Greek heritage and Egyptian context. By Shakespeare's time, Cleopatra had become the ultimate femme fatale, a woman whose beauty destroyed kingdoms and whose sexuality was her only real source of power. This interpretation reached its apotheosis in Hollywood, where Elizabeth Taylor's portrayal in 1963 established the image that most people still carry: spectacular beauty, elaborate costumes, and seduction as the primary mode of political action. But the real Cleopatra was something far more interesting and far more impressive than a beautiful seductress. She was one of the best educated people in the ancient Mediterranean, trained in the scholarly tradition of the Musion and the Library of Alexandria. She studied mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and rhetoric with some of the finest minds of her age. She was the author of treatises on cosmetics, medicine, and other scientific subjects that survived into the medieval period before being lost. She was, as far as we can determine, the first and only Ptolemaic ruler who bothered to learn Egyptian, the language of the people she governed, which gave her access to the priests and the native population in ways that her Greek-speaking ancestors had never achieved. She spoke at least 9 languages fluently, probably more, and could conduct diplomacy directly with visitors from across the known world without relying on interpreters who might mistranslate or misrepresent her intentions. This linguistic ability was not merely impressive, it was a genuine strategic advantage that gave Cleopatra power that no other contemporary ruler possessed. Consider what it meant in practical terms. When a delegation arrived from Judea, Cleopatra could speak with them in Hebrew and discuss their religious texts in the original language. When Arab tribal chiefs came seeking alliance or tribute, she could negotiate in Arabic and quote their own proverbs back to them. When Greek philosophers visited Alexandria, she could debate with them in their native tongue at the highest level of sophistication. When Roman senators and generals arrived expecting to deal with an Eastern barbarian through interpreters, they found themselves facing someone who spoke better Latin than most of them, understood Roman history and literature, and could quote Virgil or Cicero while making subtle points about Roman politics. The psychological impact of this linguistic virtuosity cannot be overstated. Every visitor who expected to have an advantage through language found themselves wrong-footed, their assumptions shattered, their confidence undermined by the realization that they were not dealing with someone who could be patronized or manipulated. Plutarch's comparison of Cleopatra's voice to an instrument of many strings captures something essential about how she operated. An instrument is something that must be mastered through practice, something that produces different effects depending on how it is played, something that can be subtle or powerful as the situation demands. Cleopatra did not have one way of speaking or one persona that she presented to everyone. She adapted to her audience, reading them in real time, adjusting her tone and her content to produce the effect she desired. With Caesar, who was intellectually vain and bored by most conversation, she apparently played the role of intellectual equal and challenger, engaging him in debates about philosophy, history, and governance that he rarely got from anyone else. With Antony, who was more emotional and less cerebrally ambitious than Caesar, she emphasized shared pleasures, understanding, and emotional connection, becoming his companion in revelry as well as his political ally. With Egyptian priests, she presented herself as the living Isis, the goddess incarnate who understood and honored their traditions. With Greek scholars, she was the patron and participant in their studies, the queen who had read the same texts and could discuss them with genuine insight. This chameleon-like ability to shift presentation while maintaining authenticity is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Most people who try to be all things to all people come across as insincere or manipulative. Cleopatra apparently managed to make each version of herself feel genuine, to make each person she spoke with believe that they were seeing the real her, the authentic person behind the royal masks. This is the essence of charisma, not the ability to dazzle everyone with the same brilliant performance, but the ability to make each individual feel uniquely seen and understood. Modern research on charismatic leadership emphasizes exactly these qualities: active listening, emotional attunement, the ability to make people feel valued and important. Cleopatra was practicing these techniques 2,000 years before they were formalized into leadership theory. The voice itself was clearly an important part of her effect. Ancient sources emphasize the sweetness of her voice, the way it drew people in and held their attention. We have no recordings and can never know exactly what she sounded like, but we can infer something from the descriptions. The voice was apparently not loud or dominating, but rather warm and modulated, capable of intimacy and intensity without ever becoming harsh. She probably had excellent control of pacing, using silence effectively, allowing her words to land before moving to the next point. She likely had a gift for mimicry, able to adjust her accent and inflection to match whoever she was speaking with, creating unconscious rapport through vocal matching. These are techniques that modern vocal coaches teach to actors and public speakers, but Cleopatra developed them naturally or through training that has not survived in the historical record. Her emotional intelligence was equally remarkable, the ability to read people accurately, to understand what motivates them, to predict how they will respond to different approaches. These are skills that separate exceptional leaders from merely competent ones. Cleopatra demonstrated this intelligence repeatedly in her political career. She understood that Julius Caesar, despite his military genius and political success, was starved for intellectual stimulation and genuine challenge. She gave him both, presenting herself as someone who could match his intelligence and engage him in the kind of sophisticated conversation he could not find among his Roman peers. She understood that Mark Antony, for all his military prowess, felt underappreciated and misunderstood by Roman society, which looked down on his lack of aristocratic refinement. She offered him acceptance and admiration without judgment, creating an emotional bond that proved stronger than his political ambitions. She understood that Egyptian priests wanted a ruler who honored their traditions and spoke their language, and she became that ruler in ways that no Ptolemaic pharaoh had done before. This understanding extended to mass psychology as well as individual relationships. Cleopatra stage-managed her public appearances with the skill of a modern image consultant. The entrance to Caesar rolled in a carpet was not just bold. It was brilliant theater that created a memorable story that would be told and retold, establishing her as someone extraordinary from their first meeting. The voyage to meet Antony on a golden barge with purple sails, dressed as Aphrodite with attendants costumed as cupids and sea nymphs, was a spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses and create an impression of divine magnificence that would put Antony off balance before negotiations even began. These theatrical presentations were not evidence of vanity or frivolity. They were calculated political moves designed to establish psychological dominance through overwhelming display. Cleopatra understood that humans are visual creatures, that first impressions matter enormously, and that creating the right setting could determine the outcome of a negotiation before a single word was spoken. Her education in rhetoric and philosophy gave her additional tools that most rulers of her era lacked. She could construct arguments with logical precision, anticipating objections and addressing them preemptively. She could use metaphor and analogy to make complex ideas accessible and memorable. She could appeal to emotion without sacrificing logical coherence, combining pathos and logos in the way that Aristotle's rhetoric prescribed. When she needed to persuade Caesar to support her claim to the Egyptian throne against her brother's faction, she apparently made a case based not on emotion or personal appeal, but on strategic logic. She was the better ruler for Egypt, the one more capable of maintaining stability and ensuring the grain supply that Rome needed, the one whose reign would serve Roman interests more effectively. Caesar was convinced, and he supported her not because she was beautiful or because he was bewitched, but because her argument made sense. The treatises she authored demonstrate intellectual ambitions that went beyond political necessity. Her work on cosmetics and medicine, though lost to us now, was apparently substantial enough to be copied and transmitted for centuries after her death. Medical historians in the Islamic Golden Age cited her writings, and Byzantine scholars mentioned her contributions to pharmacology. This was not dilettante dabbling by a bored aristocrat. This was serious scholarship that engaged with the scientific knowledge of her time and added to it. She had access to the Library of Alexandria and the scholars of the Maussion, and she used that access not merely for her education, but to contribute to the sum of human knowledge. How many monarchs in history can claim the same? How many rulers were not just patrons of learning, but actual participants in it? Not just collectors of scholars, but colleagues who could engage with them at their own level. The Romans found all of this deeply threatening because it challenged fundamental assumptions about female capability and proper gender roles. Roman society was rigidly patriarchal. Women were expected to be modest, quiet, domestic, focused on children and household management. Educated women existed but were often viewed with suspicion, and women who involved themselves in public affairs were condemned as unnatural and dangerous. Cleopatra violated every one of these expectations. She was educated beyond most Roman men. She ruled independently as a sovereign. She commanded armies, managed treasuries, conducted diplomatic negotiations as an equal with the most powerful men in the world. Worse, she was apparently better at these things than most men, more intelligent, more sophisticated, more politically astute. Compare Cleopatra to the ideal Roman woman as exemplified by figures like Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi, whose greatest virtue was supposedly her devotion to her sons and her modest retirement from public life after her husband's death. Or consider Octavia, Octavian's sister and Antony's Roman wife, who was praised for her patience, her loyalty, and her domestic virtue, all passive qualities that centered on serving male relatives. These women were held up as models precisely because they accepted their subordinate position and never challenged male authority. Cleopatra was the opposite of everything they represented. She did not wait for men to make decisions. She made them herself. She did not defer to male judgment. She trusted her own. She did not confine herself to domestic concerns. She operated on the world stage, and she demonstrated through her success that women were capable of everything men could do, which was the most dangerous message imaginable in a patriarchal society. The Romans could not admit this, so they reframed her success as seduction. If Cleopatra conquered through beauty and sex, then her triumphs did not challenge male superiority. They merely demonstrated female manipulation, which could be condemned even as it was acknowledged. This reframing has done enormous damage to our understanding of Cleopatra and to our ability to see her as she actually was. When we imagine her as primarily beautiful, we miss the intelligence that was her real source of power. When we reduce her relationships with Caesar and Antony to seduction, we miss the genuine political alliances and mutual interests that made those relationships functional. When we present her as a tragic romantic figure who chose love over duty, we miss the calculating pragmatism that characterized her entire reign. Cleopatra was not trying to seduce the Roman world. She was trying to preserve Egyptian independence and secure her dynasty's future by forming strategic alliances with whoever held power in Rome. The fact that these alliances involved romantic relationships does not make them less strategic or less pragmatic. She used every tool available to her, including her gender and her sexuality, but those were never her primary tools. Her primary tools were her mind, her voice, and her ability to understand and influence the people she needed to convince. The contrast with how Rome treated male rulers who formed alliances through marriage is instructive. When Roman men married for political advantage, making connections with powerful families or foreign rulers, this was praised as statesmanship. When Pompey married Caesar's daughter Julia to cement their political alliance, no one suggested he was being seduced or manipulated. When Octavian divorced his first wife to marry Livia and gain her family's support, no one portrayed him as enslaved by passion. The same political calculation that was normal and praiseworthy in men was treated as evidence of depravity and manipulation in Cleopatra. This double standard has persisted through history, affecting not only how we remember Cleopatra, but how we judge female leaders and female ambition more generally. Recovering the real Cleopatra requires looking past 2,000 years of accumulated distortion and seeing her as her contemporaries actually saw her. Not all of them, not the ones who hated her or feared her or needed her to be a monster, but the ones who actually met her and recorded their impressions before propaganda solidified into accepted fact. Those sources emphasize intelligence, education, linguistic ability, charisma, and emotional understanding. They describe someone who could captivate through conversation rather than appearance, who could dominate negotiations through preparation and insight rather than feminine wiles. They present a ruler who was formidable because she was brilliant, dangerous because she was competent, threatening because she demonstrated that women could govern as well as or better than men. This Cleopatra is more impressive than the beautiful seductress of legend. Physical beauty is an accident of genetics, something given rather than earned, something that fades with age. Intelligence, education, linguistic mastery, emotional understanding, charisma. These are achievements, qualities developed through effort and practice. The real Cleopatra built her power through decades of study, through conscious cultivation of skills that would serve her political goals. She was not born to rule successfully. She made herself into someone who could rule successfully, despite being a woman in a world controlled by men, despite governing a kingdom surrounded by Roman power, despite facing enemies who commanded resources far greater than hers. The tragedy is not that she lost in the end. Everyone loses eventually. The tragedy is that her real accomplishments have been buried beneath propaganda. She deserves to be remembered as one of the great minds of antiquity, someone who mastered languages that most rulers never bothered to learn, someone who understood human psychology well enough to influence the most powerful men of her age. She deserves to be remembered as a ruler who maintained Egyptian independence for 2 decades against overwhelming pressure, who patronized scholarship and science, who tried desperately to save her children and her kingdom when everything was collapsing. The voice that Plutarch described, the instrument of many strings that could adapt to any audience, is lost to us now. We will never hear how Cleopatra spoke to Caesar or debated with Antony. But we can stop reducing her to physical beauty she did not possess and recognize the real sources of her power. Her beauty secret was not cosmetics or genetics. It was intelligence, education, emotional understanding, and the voice that could make anyone feel important when she spoke to them. That combination was far more dangerous than mere beauty could ever be. And that is why Rome worked so hard to erase it from history and replace it with a simpler, safer story about a seductress who loved unwisely and lost.